Hey again, Path of Exile 2 players, Lex here with a build update, and I know it's been relatively recent since my last video where I put a spotlight on the Armor Explosion and Magma Barrier combo. However, I felt the need to get this video out fairly quickly because, well, as I sort of hinted at in the previous video, this build has already undergone some big changes, but the core gameplay is more or less the same. We just optimized the heck out of everything. We got more AoE, more damage, and more tankiness. This build is now capable of clearing maps even faster than before, and now sporting some pretty respectable boss killing damage. I was finally able to kill Zarokh and get those final 2 Ascendancy points, which I'll go over in a bit. Clearing Citadels, no problem. Clearing level 81, level 82 maps, no problem, etc. And now I'm getting ready for that Herald of Ash fight. It's starting to feel like a real end-to-end game build. Like the last video, I'm going to spend a bit of time going over the skills, but not as much as before because I thoroughly touched upon each one in that first video, so you can go watch that one if you want. But I'm going to go over the bigger changes of what's significantly different from that first version of the build, and then include some longer clips of gameplay with the build to round things off. The new version of the build. With that said, let's get into it. Real quick, let's go over the bigger additions to the build, and most noticeably at the top here, we actually have enough intelligence to utilize Svalin's Cast on Block ability. Now the downside here, unfortunately, is that Cast on Block is restricted to spell-type skills only, meaning that the vast majority of spells that we can slot into this ability aren't going to hit very hard because you need a bunch of spell damage to kind of boost up their damage to being useful in the end game. Spell damage is not a role that this build is interested in stacking. That said, there are a few spells that scale on their own without having to crank up the spell damage at all with your gear, one of those being Detonate Dead. You can see here that the damage is based off on the maximum life of a corpse of a mob that you've killed. Which is great because we don't want to crank up spell damage at all, and you can see it actually deals a bit of fire damage, but really this part here is doing the heavy lifting, the dealing physical damage equal to the 20% of the corpse's maximum life. Ultimately, I'd say Cast on Block is fun, but not super necessary to the build. I definitely notice when it goes off, and it helps during some big AoE clearing, but you do have to sacrifice quite a bit of your gear's rolls to intelligence just to meet the quota, so I think overall it's probably best to ignore Cast on Block and just go with stats that you want instead of trying to crank up intelligence so much. But for now, I'm messing with it and enjoying it, so it's here to stay. Oh, and real quick, the other support gems are Impetus and Energy Retention. This is basically to help Cast on Block go off a little bit more often. You know, as you block, you build up energy, and once you meet a certain threshold of energy, that's when the socketed spell goes off. So these 2 gems are just helping me get energy more, or retain energy, so that it goes off more often. And Spell Echo is here because when Detonate Dead does go off, I want it to go off twice just to get a little more value out of it. So this is a pretty good combination of support gems here for this ability, and that's just the way it's going to be for a bit. And next up we have Mace Strike. I talked about this in my last video a bit, as you know, it's not the main DPS option, but now I've actually boosted its DPS to be one of the best ways to deal with mobs and rares, and even bosses in some cases. With the way this new build works, as long as things are ignited, you're going to be cranking DPS and stun build up with this thing. I basically use this over Perfect Strike now most times to deal with magic packs and rares. It's quick and it hurts, and it's good DPS against bosses as well. Basically, if Hammer of the Gods is on cooldown and the boss is ignited by something strong like Hammer of the Gods or Perfect Strike, I'm constantly smacking them with this ability. It's been working really well, and I still have Culling Strike, so you will delete the last bit of a boss's health bar, no matter the number. And just real quick, I'll mouse over the combination of support gems. I went over all of these in my first video, so again, you can watch that to just kind of hear my reasoning for each one of these, but these are here to basically crank up the damage of Mace Strike, and especially Immolate, because I'm not interested in inflicting Ignite with Mace Strike, but this will boost its damage by 30% on ignited enemies, and it's very easy to ignite things with this build, so that's why this is here, and that's why this hits so hard. And this is actually the second weapon set's Mace Strike. We're going to talk about that later. This is not important. I don't really use the second weapon set's Mace Strike, but up next we have Encase in Jade, and I mentioned this in my previous video, but it's a decent defensive option. I like the passive physical damage reduction it grants you, and the active is okay. That's all I can really say about it because it's kind of hard to use effectively, honestly. I mean, I'll meme on some bosses and rares every now and then by casting like Hammer of the Gods and then just encasing in Jade right under where the hammer's about to land, but it still feels risky because you're susceptible to damage over time effects while you're just sitting there frozen, and if there are mobs still alive when you break out of that spell, they could potentially just burst you down anyway. I wish it was a little bit better, to be honest. I think you could use a bit bit of a buff. I mean, honestly, I think you should be able to break out of the encasement on command at any time during its duration. I think that would go, do a little bit to help it. But for right now, I didn't really need to put those ascendancy points anywhere else. We were breaking armor a lot before, but I found that this new version of the build is more efficient and works better without the armor break. So here we are. Magma Barrier is here, mostly the same from the first video, though we are relying a little more heavily on this support gem here, Fiery Death, to assist with our screen clearing. It is effective, even if there is a bit of a delay before the explosions occur. It's still totally worth it and very strong. Also, Rage is here as an easy crank for some of our other abilities. This builds up Rage every time you successfully pull off Magma Barrier, so you build up Rage pretty quickly when mapping, especially in like a crowd of enemies. I mean, the synergy between Ignition and Fiery Death is pretty straightforward. Ignition gives Magma Barrier 100% more chance to ignite everything it hits, and Fiery Death means that 60% of those things that die while ignited will explode on death. So that's kind of why these are paired together, and it's honestly pretty strong. However, if I'm about to fight a boss, I'll actually pop Ignition down to Hammer of the Gods here, just because we want that ability to ignite every time it hits the boss. As I showed you in the last video, the ignite damage from our heaviest hitting abilities often does much more damage than the initial hit of the ability itself. So just something to keep in mind here. Just make sure you switch Ignition to Hammer of the Gods for big ignite damage when you're bossing. Otherwise, I just keep it here when mapping because, again, the synergy between these two is really good for clearing groups out quickly. And the last support gem for Magma Barrier is Magnified Effect. This is the same as the first video, just more AoE. It just lets, covers more ground, does more damage, clears groups easier, etc. Well, let's just go over Hammer of the Gods. As I said in my previous video, this is our heaviest hitting ability. We use this on bosses and rares if desired, though these days with rares I can kind of get by with Mace Strike if they're ignited. But yeah, for this ability, you want to make sure it ignites when bossing. That much is clear. It's very super duper important. And I'll swap out this Fire Penetration gem for the Ignition gem, as I showed earlier. But the rest are just support gems that kind of boost its damage, as much as I can. Heft is actually really strong. You might think it's a little inefficient because Avatar Fire converts all physical damage to 75% fire damage. But compared to other support gems, this was still one of the biggest boosts to this ability. So honestly, it's just going to stay here. However, the one support gem I could see you swapping out is Concentrated Effect. I like this here because it's a huge damage increase, but again, it has like a huge area of effect decrease, so it's kind of like a plus and minus thing here. I think the pros outweigh the cons for me personally. If you have, if you wait for the right moment to use Hammer of Gods when you know the boss or your target isn't going to move, I think you can get by with using Concentrated Effect. But if you don't like reducing the AoE that much, I think you probably swap this out with Rage Forge. Yeah, I have it under Perfect Strike right now because it's a 35% more damage increase, which is pretty close to 40%. You just need to have 10 Rage to consume for that damage boost. So I could see you swapping these two perhaps. And it's not hard to get Rage. If you shout with this build, you will get 10 Rage at minimum, I think, on a lot of bosses and rares. So it could work, but you do have to be a little closer and you have to make sure that the shout hits your target. So it's a little riskier in that way. So that's kind of my reasoning as to why these are sitting where they are currently. Anyways, Perfect Strike is a bit different in this version of the build. It is still very important, but it has taken more of a backseat compared to Mace Strike as far as like mapping and DPS goes. However, it's still very strong against bosses, and as I mentioned earlier, this thing has a strong ignite coupled in with a 100% chance to ignite when perfectly timed. So I basically use this to keep ignite up on bosses while smacking up with Mace Strike when Hammer of the Gods is on cooldown. Other than that, you could use it to kill rares if you want. It does still hit very hard, so you could use this instead of Mace Strikes or the plethora of AoE abilities we have at our disposal. It's really situational, but I do whip this one out occasionally against rares if there are no corpses around, and I don't think Mace Strikes are going to cut it down fast enough. So yeah. And again, these are the support gems which are subject to change. It's really just about keeping ignite up on my targets, and I just kind of slide these in here. It's not hitting as hard as it could, though I may play around with it a little more and try to boost its damage more and make it like my main damage dealer again, compare it to Mace Strike. We'll see. We'll see. All right, now this is a new and very important addition to the build, Flammability. This is the level 14 version, but I still find it almost as effective as the higher level versions because you're only missing out on like a few percentage points of fire resistance reduction. So I use this lower level one because it requires less intelligence. The effect itself is pretty straightforward. After a short delay, you'll lower your enemy's fire resistance by a substantial percentage and a small AoE. But I think it's much more important to go over the support gems to kind of give you guys an idea of what its purpose is, which probably won't won't surprise any of you. Basically, I've gemmed it in a way that makes it essential to cast on like tough mobs and bosses before any other ability. Like obviously you want to cast Infernal Cry to empower something like Hammer of the Gods on like a boss, but this must also be cast before that Hammer of Gods lands, because we are boosting the fire damage so much with fire exposure, just igniting things in an AoE. There are so many passive skill tree nodes that boost your damage, with this build at least, that boost your damage on ignited enemies. So we really want to make sure that things are ignited. So that helps with this, this skill helps with that, and the fire exposure is also just a huge bonus. We have things that amplify fire exposure, so this really just brings down the fire resistance of your target, which in turn amplifies your fire damage by a lot on some targets. Honestly, I cast this all the time on bosses and while mapping. It's really strong, huge damage boost for very little time, very little investment. Yeah, highly recommend it. Leap Slam is exactly the same in purpose overall as the first video, but I've moved the Overpower support gem, you can see here, into this ability so that it better queues up like groups of mobs for a heavy stun for a big Bone Shatter. And real quick, here are the other support gems. Again, more explanation in that previous video, but let's go over Bone Shatter real quick. This has undergone a bit of a change. This is where our Armor Explosion support gem now lives alongside this useful Devastate support gem, and you can see why these two are paired together. As I mentioned last time, Bone Shatter is made to inflict heavy stuns when we see mobs primed for stun, so Devastate lets us fully break armor on our target when we do so, and the Armor Explosion actually chains a bit off of the skill based on its ability to heavy stun others in an AoE. Armor Explosion no longer chains off of itself, but the heavy stun on this ability can. So we get a pretty decent supportive like screen clear from this ability. And again, 95% of our enemies are probably going to be melting to Magma Barrier, but if you ever see, you know, like the primed for stun symbol, you use this ability instead. It clears things pretty well, and will let you get some precious time in the middle of like a big fight to empty out that stagger meter. And unsurprisingly, the Leap Slam Bone Shatter combo is also really useful against mobs that you know you can't block. Like as you play this build over time, you're going to become aware of attacks that you cannot block, so you're going to waste no time and just leap into those mobs, prime them for a stun, and then just wipe them out. As far as the other support gems, we have Impact Shockwave. This is essential. This is kind of what gives it the AoE clearing that I'm talking about. Eternal Flame, this is a placeholder. I need to find something better here. Probably something like Execute or something like that, just to boost its damage a little more. So yeah, this is just a placeholder. Infernal Cry is pretty much the same, although I added Dazing Cry here, so that's the only thing that's changed. Then we have Shield Charge, which is also mostly the same, although I put Unbreakable here so that we're not stunned while charging. And I also really like Second Wind with this ability. It just feels, the cooldown reduction I have, what is it called? Ingenuity. I have Ingenuity slotted here, so the cooldown reduction paired with Second Wind actually feels really good, and honestly kind of helps you feel like I'm traveling across the map a little faster, because I feel like warriors are kind of starved for mobility options at the moment, so that feels really good. But also being able to queue up 2 shield charges in a row to build up stun on a boss or something like that is pretty good. So honestly, I could see me like throwing these gems around in other abilities for more usefulness, but it's not, you know, it's not completely useless here, and it is pretty effective, so this is just how it's going to be for a bit. And last is Time of Need, which hasn't changed since the last video. I just have it turned off because it was driving me crazy when I was recording last time because of the sound just going on and on and on. So yeah, I still use this. It's just a survivability aura, heals you, removes debuffs, a little bit of everything you want when you're going for survivability, so really useful aura. Though I will once again take this opportunity to say, for your auras, do not run Herald of Ash. I have no idea why other content creators are trying to say it is good. It is not. It barely does any damage in a very small AoE. I think the scaling needs some reworking, and I genuinely believe that GGG messed up the numbers on this one, because the overkill damage you have to deal for it to be effective is a bit wild, considering the percentage numbers here. I said in my last video that this isn't bugged, but apparently it is bugged, because although it says it ignites enemies, apparently the burn it applies doesn't even count as an ignite, and it can't be boosted by ignite support gems. If we try real quick to, let's see, slot in, yeah, Searing Flame, you can't even do it. It also doesn't do any explosion damage or hit damage. I have no idea why I've heard some content creators saying it does this. It literally just applies a burning damage over time effect to things in a small 1 meter AoE based on overkill damage. And the damage it deals is pathetic. End of story. I'm serious. If somebody tells you to use Herald of Ash in its current state, I'd raise an eyebrow because they probably don't know what they're talking about. I've seen it in a few videos and it's hilarious because they basically just read the description of Herald of Ash and say it's effective, move on without considering that the numbers are garbage. Anyways, that's the skills overview, short and sweet, right? Not really, but anyways, let's take a look at the new passive skill tree. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over the entire skill tree. I think I will cover the bigger changes from the previous video. And I think I'll start with the biggest change potentially, which is we've gone way up here into the sorcerer's domain for this juicy fire node with some strong small passives leading up to these strong notable passives, you know, tons of fire damage, fire resistance that kind of helps our itemizations, gain 8% of damage as extra fire damage. I find that gaining a percentage of damage as whatever damage is pretty strong in this game, and then more fire damage here, penetration, just all things that we want for fire damage. And as you can see in the middle here, I've allocated my second weapon set points here because I'm not really interested in ignite damage for mapping, you know, since we're blowing things up so fast with the way this build currently is. So we're not really getting that much value out of ignite damage, at least when mapping. But since my second weapon set is made for boss killing, we actually want to amplify the ignite damage on Hammer of the Gods as much as we can. So that's why this is set up the way it is. Oh, real quick, let's go over the ascendancy points. I almost always forget to do this when I'm recording. But yeah, I already went over Encase and Jade, but these 2 points down here actually greatly assist us in clearing big groups. I guess I shouldn't have said Infernal Cry is mostly the same because I actually realize I'm using it a bit differently now. I tend to use it in the middle of a big fight when I know there are a bunch of corpses on the ground to just absolutely demolish the rest of the group quickly. The damage is so worth it. It's physical damage. I'm not sure if it's reduced by Avatar of Fire, but it's still just so worth it. It's more screen clear. You can often just insta-kill rares with their little groups if you time it right. You don't even need that many corpses on the ground, to be honest. Definitely give this one a try. Again, Encase and Jade I'm kind of on, but this one I am fully on board with. It's great. Anyways, we'll just work backwards from that fire node up here because everything around here is pretty much different from the first video. But yeah, as you can see, there are some pretty strong fire nodes down here, and I'm currently working my last few levels towards these right here. I initially did have these, but I found that grabbing more AoE and damage nodes closer to, you know, where the warrior starts on the passive skill tree was more efficient. But I don't deny that these nodes here are really strong for fire build. So I'm currently working my way with my last few levels to kind of get these fire nodes here. And if it makes sense to, I might shift a few points around to just have them earlier. So we'll see. This node here, All Natural, is a super strong one, and I knew I wanted to grab this while I was in the neighborhood. It's 30% elemental damage, 5% to resistances is great, and these 10% elemental damage nodes along the way are pretty strong as well. Oh, and real quick, you can see my second weapon set here is getting these ignite magnitude nodes here. I really don't like ignite chance because our ignite chance is pretty much 100% with the way that we're shifting that support gem around. Ignition and also perfect strike just has a 100% chance to ignite if you time it right. So I find that ignite chance are pretty inefficient nodes to grab, but they were kind of a necessary evil here to get these really good amplification ones here. And down here we have my first time lost ruby. It seems to make sense here as far as fitting a bunch of small passives into the radius. So I'm getting a little fire penetration for each one, each small passive, while the notables are getting me some block chance, war cry, recovery rate, and increased knockback distance, which I'm not really interested in that last one, but hey, this was cheap, so I'm happy with where it is right now. I know there are probably better time lost gem options out there, but this will stay here for now as I wanted it for the block chance to stay above 50%, and I wanted the extra chunk of fire penetration. So yeah, that's why this is here. And you can see we spec'd into the shield node here, grabbing a ton of block chance to kind of make Svalin do some more work to keep us alive, and also we're bumping up our tankiness and armor with the armor and energy shield nodes here. This one here, this notable passive, Adamant Recovery, does quite a bit of work when recharging your shield just by itself, so definitely recommend picking this one up if you are using hybrid pieces like me at this point. We'll get more into the gear later. And other than that, I mean, things are pretty much the same from my previous video. You can see I've shifted things around to grab some AoE stuff here and there with my first weapon set, and you can see that they're allocated to my first weapon set because I don't really care about area of effect when I'm bossing or when I want to hit with Hammer of the Gods. I just want as much damage and as as much ignite damage as possible, so that's why these are allocated to weapon set 1. And yeah, expect to have block chance here because we have access to the best block chance nodes up here. But yeah, I mean, this is feeling like nothing but a huge upgrade from the previous version of the build. Highly recommend trying this one if you're a fan of Magma Barrier at all. I know I am. I can't believe how quickly it wipes groups. It's kind of insane. It's just based on its animation time, I think. It's just so quick to trigger Magma Barrier over and over again. And it also feels really strong being able to attack and block essentially at the same time. And again, I'm still working towards my ideal second weapon setup, which will be most likely 2 one-handed maces, expert smithing hammers, which will crank up the initial hits and ignites damage of Hammer of the Gods and Perfect Strike to just melt bosses. I'm not really interested in blocking most of them, although keep in mind that there are some bosses that have some pretty blockable attacks, and blocking is pretty strong, and you get a little more value against Magma Barrier against them. I think a good example of this is Zarokh, and or I think that's his name, the time boss at the end of the Trial of Secumus, where you can easily just block his telegraph projectile attack and just, you know, the projectiles flying around like crazy all the time during that fight. But yeah, overall I'm not blocking as much against bosses or using Magma Shield as much against them, so that's more of my group clearing mapping ability. Yeah, so just want to throw that out there. And with that said, let's look at the gear. All right, I'm in the middle now. So gear has undergone a pretty big change. As you can see, I'm utilizing a bunch of hybrid pieces to make a good chunk of energy shield for us because we have enough intelligence to be able to afford to wear these pieces, you know, from wanting to use cast on block and flammability. And we are just so much tankier than before. I think I was around 3k life before, and with this new version of the build, we're at 3.1k life and almost 1,000 energy shield. So I feel a little silly calling that last build a tank build, even with how much better this one is. But yeah, we're getting a big boost to it from the passive skill tree, obviously, those nodes that we went over, and also from the chest piece here. Once again, still using Warrior Invictus. You know, every time we socket a soul core, we're getting boosts to armor and energy shield, things like this. So really strong, unique. It's not necessary for the build, but definitely, you know, I'm using it. It's better. What I'm trying to say is I'm getting more value out of it now by having energy shield, because it now boosts up energy shield and my health with each socketed soul core. I mentioned that I had to pay a bit closer attention to my stats this time around, as I needed enough intelligence to cast the spells that I wanted, just a bit above 130. So I had to get some gear that like rolled intelligence, like my gloves and, you know, some of my rings here. You know, I had a decent pair of boots with intelligence, but this had more move speed, so I just kind of have these with a crappy strength roll, but, you know, still does the job. I do like this movement speed boost. And yeah, other than that, I'm just cranking up max life and armor and energy shield rolls on gear where I can, just to get tanked up. Feels pretty strong at the moment, and I'm still on a lookout for more optimal pieces, but this has been working very well currently. And real quick, the main weapon in the previous video is now part of my second weapon set now, since it's aimed at killing bosses, and I need as much damage as I can for the second weapon set. So here it is. It hits a little bit harder than my you know, the smithing hammer here, which is a good smithing hammer, but when I corrupted it, I got unlucky and didn't get the second socket for it. So, you know, I got some extra chaos damage, which is fine, but really I was looking for that extra socket so I could put another one of these soul cores in there and get another 30% increased elemental damage with attacks. Wasn't lucky this time. Though I gotta mention that even though the ideal would be 2 double-socketed maces, you know, either expert-plated maces or expert smithing hammers, using a focus is actually a pretty legit option, and a lot cheaper too. Like, I've gotten a couple of decent ones for just 15 exalted orbs, and you can just filter them out by just pure fire damage, you know, and with some of the higher rolls, you can significantly boost it by just so much. I still think the ideal offhand, again, is going to be like a god roll smithing hammer with like a big fire damage roll, a big damage to elemental attacks roll, a melee weapon skill roll, and corrupted for 2 sockets, obviously, again, because focuses are considered armor, I believe. You can't socket them with the soul core and get the damage. You would get the elemental resistance out of it. So that's the one big downside. But again, just crunch the numbers, this is a pretty good alternative. Really cheap also. Yeah, even without sockets, they are totally capable. And I think the more expensive ones have caster-focused rolls on them, so you're able to get pretty effective focuses for a meleeer because you're not interested in those high-end caster rolls for, again, really cheap. I highly recommend looking at the market. But that's the gear, short and sweet, and that's pretty much the build in a nutshell. Honestly, as I've been playing and grabbing more fire damage nodes in the passive skill tree, I'm realizing that this build might be better suited for Titan in some way, just because you'd be be getting so much more out of those fire damage nodes from the ascendancy points that gives you 50% more from all of them. But I don't know, I might miss the Turtle Charm tankiness and the clears that the War Cries are now giving me. And honestly, I cannot tell you how many times Turtle Charm has saved me. I am quite clumsy when playing. But yeah, as I said earlier, I'm going to close the video out with some longer clips of gameplay so you can kind of see how I use this build to clear maps and fight bosses, etc. And yeah, that's going to be it for this one. Till next time.
From my ancestors! Now for you! Nice try! First one's eye. I smell your blood. I'm not ready. Ravenous.